Pop Occulture show where we talk about the crossroads between pop culture and the occult. I'm one of your co-hosts, Lilith Dorsey, and that's my other co-host over there.
I'm Jason Winslade. Welcome to another episode of the Pop Occulture show. Pop Occulture. And
Jazz
you gotta have the jazz hands. And this week, we are talking about one of my favorite little properties, the Dead Boy Detectives. And I was a comic fan. We'll talk about the comics in a little bit. But yeah, I got even back when I bought single issue comics about, I don't know, about 10 years ago. These are from 2014. And so I was a fan of Dead Boy Detectives from their inception in Neil Gaiman's Sandman. And now there's a show on Netflix that dropped its first season of last month, maybe. I'm pretty sure I've seen the whole thing. Well, you've seen part of it.
part of it.
Pretty sure there's going to be spoilers involved. So if you haven't seen the show, watch the show. Or if you're just curious about it, well, I won't be too heavy on the spoilers, but still some things will be revealed. So the Dead Boy Detectives were characters in the original Sandman run in the late 80s, early 90s for the storyline Season of Mists. And that was, I believe, collected in the fourth trade paperback for Sandman. But the conceit is that at that point, the devil, Lucifer, decides to leave hell and to get revenge on Morpheus, the Sandman, and gives him the key and says, "Here, you deal with it." And then Lucifer then goes off and has his own spin-off show. And so at this point, all these spirits from this British Academy who were in hell basically come back to the school and start reenacting all the awful shit that they did to each other in 1916 when the main character of this story, Edwin Payne, is bullied to death. And at the time, all the real kids had left school except for Charles, and Charles then winds up getting caught up in the whole thing, and he gets bullied to death by the ghosts. And so the two of them are both dead, and they're like, well, no one's claiming our souls, so let's go and have adventures. And they decide, we don't have to stay here. We don't have to haunt this place forever. Let's just move on. And so in the comics, so they show up in a few of Neil Gaiman's things later on, but then they eventually get spun off into their own series, miniseries mostly. Had a couple of different runs. One was, let's see, this one was in 2001. And there was a series in 2014, and then another one just, I think, last year when the Sandman universe kind of came back. And in the comics, they're much younger kids. They're kids. They're little kids. They're not, I don't believe they're high school age. I believe they're like preteen, so maybe 12, maybe 13. And they have like a tree house, and it's very, very much very different vibe in the comics. I believe the last series that came out last year, the only one I haven't read, they aged them up a little bit, and for the first time they decided to make at least Edwin gay or queer, like in the closet or whatever. And that's a big part of the show. And so the show they're much older. They're supposed to be teenagers, but they're TV teenagers. They're
Yes.
We used to say like WB or CW teenagers, where they're like they look like they're at least in their late 20s.
Yes.
But they're supposed to be teenagers in the show. It's much more of an adult premise. It's a very queer show and intended to be so.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the whole thing, and it was also meant to be a very diverse show. So they took the bones of the characters and the story, and they put it into the show. And there were a few characters that made it from the comics that became like the character of Crystal Palace, which is great name.
Yes.
Is she's changed fairly significantly, although her backstory, as you find out, is pretty close to the comics, and that she came from a very wealthy, very much like, you know, TMZ covered family. They're very they're sort of out there, famous avant-garde artist types. But yeah, there's a few characters. So like Tragic Mick is in the comics. He's one of my favorite characters in the show, and he's in the comics. He's got an actual walrus head. The idea is that he's a walrus that became human, and we're gonna talk about that story in a minute.
I love that character.
Another favorite character, the night nurse, played by our favorite Ruth Connell from Supernatural, Rowena from Supernatural. Also, is known to do the witchcraft herself. Very Scottish actress, and her character was not in the comics, although some people are saying that she's this version of the Nightmare Nurse. I don't know why they wouldn't call her the Nightmare Nurse. That's in DC Comics. That was in Justice League Dark and Swamp Thing and a few other things, but was never in the Dead Boy Detectives thing. And it's very confusing because Night Nurse is also a Marvel character that's completely different. So yeah, what's also interesting about the preparation of the show was that there was a sort of a backdoor pilot on Doom Patrol, which was originally on the DC channel and then went over to HBO Max, then Max, whatever. And they were played by two different actors, including David Tennant's son.
Oh wow!
Or child, offspring. They're non-binary. And the vibe was very different. It was very low key. And the night nurse, Ruth Connell, was in that as well. But the character was shown as being much more demonic. There was like this kind of spider face and all kinds of strange stuff. But what they did with Ruth Connell in this one is much more interesting, I think, because she's much more of like pretty much a bureaucrat, trying to like make everything all nice and tidy in a very Scottish way.
I loved that. I just loved that. It just sort of fit perfectly.
Yeah. So it was a very different vibe with Doom Patrol, and so there was a point when they originally developed it as a show, it was going to be on Max and it was going to have that Doom Patrol crossover, and they wanted to do a Sandman thing, but they couldn't because different company. But then when everything went south with Max, they got back to Netflix and were like, oh, we can use Sandman after all. And so we have a brief cameo from Death in the first episode, and then we have another Endless later on that fits in really well with what we're seeing and actually gives us more insight into the character from Sandman, who a lot of people, okay, it's Despair, and a lot of people kind of complained that Despair was sort of given the short end of the stick in Sandman in the first season because she was just shown as kind of Desire's sidekick, whereas she's the scariest of all of them, I think, in some ways. So we get to see a little bit of that in the series. So there's this, when you watch the show, and if you're used to watching these kinds of shows, there's this DNA. You got, one of the producers is Greg Berlanti, who's the DC guy, who's like done all the DC TV shows. You've got Jeremy Carver, who was involved with Doom Patrol and Supernatural, and I think the main showrunner was involved with Supernatural as well. With Steve Yockey and Beth Schwartz were the co-showrunners, and they were involved with, I believe they were involved with Doom Patrol too. So the soundtrack is very, very much like Doom Patrol, very kind of 80s, kind of electronic in some places. It also has for me, it was a very similar vibe to a lot of Canadian shows like The Magicians.
Definitely.
The characters are very similar. The kind of mythological characters are very similar.
It's got this steampunk aesthetic that I think reminds me of some of these other things that I've seen, within the realm of the supernatural, probably because of the period.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of a lot of different fingerprints on there that you can tell that crosses over with other shows. But like I said, when they were developing it, they were like, we want to do Hardy Boys on acid, is what they've said in interviews. So I don't know, and and there's
maybe some sort of weird mix of ketamine and Molly. I don't know about acid.
Right. I mean, and there's and there's some clear reference. I mean, they straight up reference Scooby Doo, and the characters are watching Scooby Doo. So yeah, it's meant to be that kind of mystery of the week combined with an overarching story arc. And a lot of it is also about the relationships between the characters, and Charles and Edwin, who have been together as ghosts for I guess 40 years at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But yet they're still trying to figure out their feelings for each other. Very clearly, Edwin has feelings for Charles. Charles likes Edwin, loves Edwin too as a friend. And there's a great scene towards the end where it's not like a coming out thing, because Edwin in a lot of ways doesn't even know it's okay to be gay in 1916, but he ultimately comes out not just as gay, but that he has feelings for Charles. And it's a really nice, even though it's like they're about to die or about to be dragged back into hell. So he's like, I won't ever get a chance to say this. And Charles is pretty chill, even though he's got all this trauma that he's dealing with from abuse from his father and from being bullied. He's very accepting. He's like, I love you too. I'm not in love with you, but let's figure this out. And so he doesn't reject him, and it's a very heartfelt scene. So yeah, there's a lot of the things are about the relationships between the characters as well. So there's that's part of the dynamic of the show. But what's interesting is that it's meant to, it was meant to be originally like a British thing in London. It starts off in London, but very quickly they go to the Pacific Northwest, because that's closer probably to Vancouver or wherever they're filming it. and so it eventually becomes this strange maritime show. And I found that fascinating. It's not really anything like the comics at all, but it has a very different vibe to it, and allows them to address folklore and occult stuff in really interesting ways. They still go to occult books. They still have invocations and finding out how to do things magically, like you see in some of these shows. But there's this whole other element that is as the maritime stuff. So
no, for me, it really vibes with that Pacific Northwest thing. There's even moments that it reminded me of Twin Peaks. You know what I mean? Like there's this energy, this darkness under the water, in the woods, things like that they keep picking up on. And yeah, I do find that fascinating. I think it also allows them to be more multicultural and more, the plots evolve more naturally. I think that the scene that really struck me from the London episode was where, they're trying to get her onto the sigils on the floor of the tube, and they put the big giant, sigil curtain over her, and then the demon rises up and runs away. Like that to me is very gritty. Like there's these tiny pieces that are left from that London grit, that kind of, there's moments where he's got this whole kind of Sid Vicious, Johnny Rotten, punk rocker kind of vibe going on that we remember, but that takes on a completely different context once we realize we're in this small town Pacific Northwest.
Right. It starts off almost like, Hellblazer, like John Constantine. That London gritty magic you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. So there's like, I want to say that, episode 4, perhaps it was when they start really delving into the mythology of the place. Episode 4 is called The Case of the Lighthouse Leapers. And one of the cool things about that setting is they, every occult show needs its magic shop. And in this case, it's the magic shop of Tragic Mick, who is the walrus who became human. And like I said in the comics, he was originally a walrus head, but it's played by I want to say the actor who played the father of Black Manta in the Aquaman movie, the Canadian black actor who's in a lot of things, and so yeah, he's the guy behind the desk, and he's, you know, selling them stuff, and he's also selling stuff to the witch, so he's kind of neutral, but sort of doesn't want the witch to do really awful things. And I mean, I think we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but like that first episode establishes that they're the witch Esther, right? So let's talk about Esther. So Esther has this house, and it's sort of taking part of the old, you know, folklore witch, you know, capturing and eating children thing, but what she's really doing is you know, kidnapping children and feeding them to her giant evil snake in the basement that then gives her power. It's not really clear, but it's kind of striking that this sort of you know, she reminds me of I don't know, like Miranda Richardson mixed with Debbie Harry mixed with Megan Mullally's character on Will and Grace. Like, you know,
Yeah,
she
there's a
kind of has
little bit
that.
of all of that in there.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and
I mean,
it
she's got her stereotypes, right? Like she's chain smoking and she's got the crows and
and the
you know,
cane.
I don't know if you can hear my crows today. They were making noise a minute ago, but I think that there's a reason it's stereotyped because it's true, right? We all know these witches in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, they don't eat babies, but this is something. I was just watching a reality show the other day that were like, witches eat babies. You know, there's still people that grew up with those myths and things like that, especially outside of the first world. And I think that that's something that people will relate to, unfortunately, you know,
Yeah, I mean,
not us as witches, but
right. I mean, those stories, you know, the old folklore stories have power, and yeah, we you know, they're not they're not true, but they lend that mystique to witchcraft, um and also because they are such powerful stories in folklore, they also give writers an opportunity to use it to say other things. Now, what's interesting about that whole first episode is that they're looking for a young missing black girl who, you know, normally when the white girl goes missing, you get all the media.
sure.
Not so
Missing
much.
wife girl syndrome. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
It's a thing.
So it's very clearly. I mean, again, the conceit of the show is that the dead boy detectives are detectives that ghosts hire. That ghosts come in and say, "Hey, you know, solve this for us," and which again is also kind of not like the comics. Um, but yeah, they find ways to work for the dead to help them figure their stuff out. And because no one is doing anything about this black girl missing, they decide to take the case on. So I mean, that's kind of a, you know, that's an interesting statement right there. That this with this whole, you know, this white privileged witch woman, you know, feeding off the power of young black children.
Well,
Um,
and that whole scene she has with Crystal where she's like, I like girls, you know, like it's so creepy that like here she is preying on another young black woman and who's not as vulnerable as the child that we saw in the basement with the snake and everything like that. But I think it does pull on our heartstrings with some of these tropes and these truisms in a way that I think really is innovative. You know, it's one of these things that's growing on me. You know, initially I was like, huh, oh, okay. You know, like it's definitely growing on me as I see more and more of it. And I love the way that they sort of uniquely turn these things on their head, right? Like, again, spoiler alert, they get the young girl in her little brownie costume back to her parents, you know? So there is that kind of like nice bow on the end of things that does remind me of Scooby-Doo or the Hardy Boys or something like that. And it allows us to focus on what it's saying in a different way.
yeah, I mean, some cases resolve like that, some don't. But I was gonna say like Esther is what's so in the story, Esther is it becomes clear that she was a village witch who made a deal with Lilith for immortality, but as these things usually go, that deal was not clear, and she got the immortality, but not the youth, the eternal youth, and so she takes it upon herself to do the whole thing with the children to get that youth. And my partner pointed out that it was interesting that she was called Esther because in the Bible, Esther was
Sure.
known for, I mean, she was a good,
Visions.
she
Yeah.
was a heroine. Yeah, but she
Yeah.
was known for her beauty, and
Yes.
that she saves the Jews from being exterminated by the Persian king because she's
Yes.
Jewish, and she's like, help my people. So there's the interesting biblical connection there with the Esther character.
I mean,
Yeah.
Lilith features largely in the Talmud, so that makes sense that this would, sort of be this other slightly familiar narrative that they've taken off into another place. I also love this thing about Lilith, like when we first get her introduced as a entity in the show, we're looking at this thing with these pictures that are in the lighthouse, right? Like she's like, oh, this is the Lilith one. You can communicate with her through the picture, which I think is fascinating. To me, it was like, oh, well, it's usually mirrors, but these dead boy detectives are in charge of the mirrors. So Lilith is going to take over the domain of paintings. And the whole Esther thing about it reminded me of Picture of Dorian Gray, right? Like she's got this eternal youth because something is attached to a painting. So we've got, again, these little, this is why I thought it was derivative. We've got these little seeds of other things that he's sort of made this beautiful quilt that goes together and takes our mind in a different way.
Yeah, that's in that episode 4 that we're talking about. That's a great scene where there's the lighthouse, the person that's in charge of the lighthouse tourist store, the gift shop, and she's this older Black woman, and she's showing all the different paintings, and Lilith is one of them. And then there's also in that episode you've got the washerwoman character that they evoke to get some kind of like prophecy or whatever, and that's a whole other thing of, because we talked about that with in other episodes about that sort of crossover of La Llorona and the Banshee, and because the washerwoman is she's washing the blood out of the clothes, and so a little bit of that Banshee story in there, and but yeah, I think in the show she's portrayed as, it seems like somewhat Latina, but it's not exactly clear. But yeah, all those myths about the water, and that we talked about, that's in your book, and we talked about the show, and then Tragic Mick is part of that too. And so yeah, there's a lot of those maritime stories that aid in what they're doing. And yeah, even the night nurse being swallowed by the giant anglerfish, and she meets this Jonah-like character who's this Indian prince or something like that, where he's like, I've been on all these adventures, and maybe you should look at life a different way or whatever. So there's
No, that was fascinating to me. And I think it's something you don't get, like you had asked me to watch a piece of the 6th episode, and it starts with the walrus character talking about Sedna. And I was like, huh, that's really interesting. And I went, and not to sell my book, but you can buy my book. There's a whole piece in here about Sedna being the Inuit goddess of the sea, and the creation story, and how she sort of got married to a seagull and things like that. And I feel like, how many times do we not hear those, indigenous stories, those Inuit stories? We hear other more, Western European folk tales. So this to me was really beautiful, that we could have this kind of Sedna story in there, and people might be exposed to it, a lot of them for the first time, and not really understand that, because it does resonate in a different way than those Western stories do. And that's what fascinates me, not just because I'm on Native North American land, but because it's stories that should have been told to me and weren't.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on with these characters where they're basically, they're trying to figure out their place in the world, and how to live their lives even when they're dead, right? The story about that is different from the comic is that he's being bullied, including by someone who it's very clear has an attraction to him, but is so closeted that turns into resentment and outwardly placed fear and anger. And so they do this thing that's evoking a demon as a prank, but of course it actually evokes the demon, and the demon's like, well, sorry, gotta take you to hell, those are the rules. In
a very British way.
Right. You know,
Like,
like, oops, sorry. And so yeah, there's that slightly different thing. And we also get that Charles was very abused by his father. And you know, he's still set in the 80s. So again, that's sort of the vibe of the thing. But so Crystal is an interesting character. And when I was sitting, I was watching, I was like, you gotta watch this show, Lilith, because she kind of reminds me of you a little bit.
oh,
Um,
thanks.
you know, she's the, like, you know, the young black psychic, and can see the ghosts. So we know. And you know, yeah, and at the beginning of the show, she's possessed by the demon David. Just has a regular name, David. And but it's her
No,
ex.
but I think that's a valuable story point. I love the way that there's a way in which what they're really saying is we get possessed by our exes, right? Like, no matter how rotten or demonic they may be, you know, there's this connection. And I love that episode where she's, you know, trying to do the spell to get rid of it, and it ends up getting rid of her powers, you know, like that there's some sort of, you know, psychic umbilical cord that attaches some of these things to other things, and we have to be careful not to cut it, because we might be left without a lifeline or without something that we absolutely need. So I think that that's really realistic and quite deep, you know, on a lot of levels.
Yeah, I mean, she's such an interesting character because she doesn't remember her past at this point in the show, and she starts to learn about it towards the end. And we see that she was not a good person even before David. And so she's like, well, I've learned and grown, you know, am I still that person? And that's one of the things that comes back in the show too, is that, like, you know, who you were when you were alive versus who you are when you're dead. um and you know, what does that mean? Like, if you take away someone's memory, if you take away their trauma, does that maybe does that maybe allow them to become a better person because they don't have all that stuff that's influencing them? And then, but then you also see in the episode that I told you not to see, there's um there's a story about, you know, ghosts that are trapped in a loop, and it's basically this guy killing his family over and over again, based on control. And this really affects Charles, and he gets caught up. He literally gets caught up in the loop. And we see that, yeah, he's hasn't really faced his own trauma, but he remembers it, whereas Crystal doesn't remember whatever she's been through, except for the stuff with David. Now, what's interesting with that story, and again, this is what I was trying to get you to watch, was at a certain point after she's been powerless, somehow there's a bunch of things she gets her powers back, but one of those things, when they're fighting Esther, I think in episode 6, um, is that somehow, I'm trying to remember how this went, but somehow she taps into this kind of dream world, and she meets her ancestors, and it's all these women sitting around a kitchen table in costumes of various time periods. And the main person she talks to has a kind of a thick you know, Jamaican or Trinidadian accent. And they say, you know, this is where you get your power from, this is what you can tap into. And they refer to it in the, I think the writers referred to it as Ancestor Island. And they were saying how that
I like that.
concept, the writers room, they came up with that concept. One of the writers is Kristen Lane Tucker, who's a black woman, and I believe she was also involved in that flight attendant show. And so, yeah, that idea came from her when they were like, yeah, we got to use this. And so she's able to tap into this set of ancestors, and that seems to be a thing. And I was like, I remember, you know, this was in Lovecraft Country. We just saw this in Echo in the Marvel, the Disney Plus series, where the Choctaw woman is able to tap into her ancestors, and so when she's fighting, it's all of her ancestors at once helping her fight. So there's all kinds of themes that's becoming more of a trope, I think, now, when you've got diverse writers in the writing room. And
I have to say Wakanda forever at this point in the story.
Yeah, and so yeah, so there's even this resolution where they help her get rid of her abusive ex, and it literally shows them sort of pushing him down into the earth to bury him in this other place, so he's not in her head anymore. But they're like, you know, you're gonna have to come get him at some point. He can't stay here forever with the ancestors. You've got to deal with this at some point. So yeah, I find that fascinating, and it's great that that stuff is in, you know, is in fantasy shows now.
Yeah.
So yeah, Crystal Palace, pretty cool. Good. So yeah, we don't know yet whether it's gonna get. We don't know yet whether it's gonna get a second season. Hopefully, they will, because they set up some really interesting dynamics and mysteries, and the night nurse now has to work with them at the end. So that's something to look forward to for season 2. And I always love seeing Ruth Connell on my screens, either in social media or in TV shows. And she's got a couple of podcasts right now that are really interesting too, that I recommend. She's got like a true crime podcast and a meditation podcast.
Oh, wow.
You know, both of those things, you know, that you see on podcasts today. But yeah, when we're also, you know, I think they started filming the second season of Sandman, although they're not calling it the second season, they're just calling it the second part. I guess, which is kind of like what Sabrina did. But there's a lot of stuff coming up in that, so I'm hoping to see that they find a way to work that in. I'm not sure that the timeline doesn't quite fit now that it's, you know, that Sandman is now modernized and not set in the 80s, which is when Charles has died. So I'm not sure how they're gonna work, you know, connect that. But yeah, it should be interesting. I love, you know, anything Sandman universe, even the Lucifer show, which is again completely different from the comics. But I would love to talk about that at some point, especially the Lilith aspects of that show.
Well, we still got lots to talk about. I'm excited.
Yeah. And so this is our second episode of May, and I want to say this is our 18th episode. So I think we've got 2 more episodes that we're going to do in this season to make it an even 20, if you can believe it, 20 episodes.
Wow.
2, and yeah, we'll take a little bit of break after that, but we'll be back with more.
We'll be back. We will have a third season.
Yeah, so our next couple of episodes, we're going to focus on, because they had that awful tarot movie, I think we need to respond to that in some way by looking at our own cool tarot stuff. Lilith has a tarot book coming out this summer, so it you know, that kind of synergy. And we'll look at some occult, well, everything occult is tarot, but some pop culture tarot things, like the newly released, as of this year, Buffy deck, and some other cool pop culture tarot decks. And we'll talk about tarot and pop culture, because that's what
we do.
Up in here. So yeah, any last words for our...
I just want to thank everybody for watching, liking, subscribing. We still have a Patreon page. Like, you know, we don't do what we do for nothing, but next to nothing. So if you can support us in any way, even a tiny bit, we really appreciate it. And thank you. And thank you for Jason for still talking to me after all of these 18 episodes.
I know we're you know, we're still friends after so many years. Okay, crazy.
A long time.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll see you next time on the Pop Culture Show. Until then, stay weird.